Now Chris has a look at other stories making headlines.
In Chicago, small amounts of pot can still land you in jail depending on who you are and where you live. Are marijuana laws being fairly enforced?
I think there's a lot of disparity between who gets stopped and who gets arrested and who doesn't. And I think it's a waste of resources.
If Chicago lands the Obama Library, it could mean big bucks for the South Side. But should Illinois taxpayers have to foot the bill?
I think it's great. His residence is here, South Side, and the University of Chicago is here, so why not?
Breastfeeding in public. A mother gets kicked out of a Chicago trade show for nursing her baby and sets off a raging debate.
It's sexist, it's silly, doesn't make any sense at all. Yeah, I mean, it's a natural thing, and there's no reason women should be ashamed of their breasts.
McDonald's new mascot has some customers puzzled. To some, happy is more like McScary.
I think that it's a little funny looking, a little weird looking.
As a marketing professional, I don't think they probably did enough research.
Joining us ready to chew on those stories and more, Michael Puente, reporter for WBEZ, author Cheryl Jefferson, and Stephanie Farmer, assistant professor of sociology at Roosevelt University. Welcome, everybody. So, speaking of Roosevelt University, an amazing study comes out saying that 93% of the marijuana tickets in 2013 led not to tickets but actual arrests. And is that, Michael, is that somewhat surprising to you?
I don't think it's surprising in the sense that it does take time sometimes for different layers of government to kind of sort of get with the program and understand what this is all. Law enforcement's always kind of the last one to kind of, get acceptance with this. I mean, this is kind of a different change in our environment, already accepting marijuana. They're already programmed to arrest people to do this. So now they're being told not to do it. It's an adjustment.
But the ordinance was passed back in 2012. These are numbers from 2013. And Cheryl, does it seem heavy-handed?
Well, apparently in Chicago, a joint will get you the joint, okay? So, on a very practical level, there are over 2 million people incarcerated in the United States right now at an average cost of $31,000 per prisoner. So, given the fact that Illinois is in massive, massive debt, in situations where there's a drug violation, where there is no harm, no, violent weapon involved, that type of thing, it might make sense to cash in on that opportunity, have people be ticketed, pay fines, and help to build Illinois' coffers a little bit.
Stephanie, 9 out of 10 getting arrested for pot in Chicago.
I agree with Michael, actually, that it's like this policy lag between the actual policy and the practice. So I don't think this is necessarily a symbol of a failure of the policy. It's just that we have to have a longer cultural change. We've had this war on drugs for 30 years. We've had these kinds of really strong arm tactics when dealing with the war on drugs. I don't think you can change that culture just within a year time.
The Chicago Reporter did an investigative piece which found that overwhelmingly those being arrested are young African-American men. Cheryl?
Well, only a quarter of the drug arrests in Illinois involve violent offenses. So, the other 3/4 are fairly benign in the greater scheme of criminal arrests. And given the racial imbalance there, you've got to think that this bears looking at in a much more clear-headed way.
Michael, could this be a version of stop and frisk, that we're going to stop you for a joint to see what else you might have?
It can, but it's also going to take, the legislature and also the judicial area, the judges, to say, hey, when you bring somebody in on this type of crime, we're not going to prosecute it. In fact, it's also going to probably take people to sue for wrongful prosecution or wrongful arrest. So again, it's going to take a cultural shift, at least with the law enforcement, and we're going to get there, but it's going to take some time, and it's unfortunate that it's going to probably be young minority people who are going to pay the price early on.
I read that even the head of the FBI said this week that he's going to consider hiring people who smoke dope because he can't get enough young people who haven't smoked marijuana. So, Stephanie, is Chicago just out of step here?
Well, it is the case that, like, with amongst like the younger generation, 60-some% are in favor of decriminalizing. In fact, the majority of Chicagoans are in favor of decriminalization. We're seeing states independently decriminalizing. I think that this is a step to maybe getting us more into sync with the national trends. This being able to ticket rather than just arrest. But at some point, I do think we have to understand, well, what were the drug laws about in the first place? Was it just about attacking drugs, the users of drugs, or going back to the earlier statistic that you pointed to, when 9 out of 10 people that are arrested and sent to jail for drugs are African American men, when we know that whites and blacks use pot at the same rates, then this enforcement of the drug war particularly targets African American men, and we have to think, well, why is that? And in some sense, it could be like you could like take into consideration people like Michelle Alexander, who suggests that this is the era of this new Jim Crow type of containment and control over African American men.
We have to move down to Springfield to look at the legislature, and Michael Madigan, the speaker, is still pushing to have the Obama Library funded partially by Illinois taxpayers. He wants taxpayers to pony up $100 million. Michael, is this a good use of taxpayer money?
You know, I'm going to say probably not, especially in a state like Illinois, which is having fiscal problems. $100 million library at a time where you probably can get, just today, President Obama is going to come into Chicago. He's going to have a major fundraiser. I think it's what, $35,000 a plate. So there's private funds out there that would probably be able to build this library without using taxpayer money, and certainly not using $100 million. That's a hard sell in a state that is struggling financially like Illinois is doing.
Cheryl, where do you come down on this?
Well, a key question here is whether this library is going to be exclusive or very inclusive, as Mr. Obama has wanted the hallmark of his presidency and his legacy to be. The presidential library system falls under the National Archives, and even though these libraries are privately funded, they are eventually turned over to the National Archives for management. So using private funds, especially at that rate, and especially looking at all the taxpayers of Illinois contributing, you have to say to yourself, maybe it's time for a new definition of what a presidential library is. Instead of a repository for historic materials, which is what essentially they are, this library, if it's going to be funded by Illinois taxpayers, needs to bring a new definition. And it needs to be inclusive. So that means, more of a community partner, internships, community programming and outreach, in which case there's added value beyond just the linked economic value, and that might be something worth considering.
There's another study out from the University of Chicago, Stephanie, which says that the library could bring in as much as $200 million or more a year, along with several thousand jobs. Is that trade-off worth it if taxpayers put down, let's say, $100 million in order to get that kind of revenue stream for Chicago?
The interesting thing about these economic studies that forecast these kinds of spillover development is that we don't have those kind of follow-through studies that see, well, did these kinds of forecasting actually happen 10 years down the road? In parallel cases, like with stadiums, what they found is that the stadiums that the public invested all these hundreds of millions of dollars in just didn't bring the kinds of economic development that people were promising. So I would just like a little more follow through, or understanding maybe like what kinds of spillover development occurred with other types of presidential libraries in large urban areas as well.
And I guess the other question is exactly what is the $100 million going for? We're not sure about that. Moving on, we're talking about trade shows and conventions and people coming for the library. Big trade show in Chicago this week. The National Restaurant Association made news when security escorted out a young mother who was nursing a 10-day-old baby. Michael, did they do the right thing here?
This is a question I actually posted on my Facebook page to try to get where are people standing on this. Escorting a mother out, breastfeeding mother looks bad. Maybe they could have did it at a different time. But in reading the story, it seems though that this trade show, it isn't open to the public. It's professional based. They don't want children there. She knew that. 10-day-old child, pretty brand new kid, I think it's not an issue of breastfeeding. It's an issue of safety. And unfortunately, the rule, she knew she should bring a child to this, and ultimately.
So you're saying rules are rules?
Rules are rules.
What
and
about
there's
common
also safety.
sense, though? I mean, this is a 10-day-old baby.
Yeah, and really, the mother broke 2 contracts, but she kept 2 contracts. So the contract that was broken, as both an attendee...
Spoken like a lawyer.
Not yet. Both as an attendee and her family business had a booth at the show. So she was well aware of what the rules were. And so in bringing a child, she did violate that contract. Perhaps the rules needed to be more specifically stated, about why children were excluded. And then she also, in a way, broke a contract with her baby, which is bringing a 10-day-old child into this gigantic trade show, which is attended by tens of thousands of people with flaming shish kebabs and popping champagne corks, is not the safest of environs. But on the plus side, she did, in fact, try to be a responsible mother, feeding her baby. And, in fact, she did fulfill the opportunity to draw a lot of attention to her family business, whether or not that was inadvertent. But I agree with Michael, common sense should rule here. And certainly the facility, not the event, but the facility could perhaps have made available an appropriate nursing room for the mother.
Stephanie, this set off an explosion in Twitter and Facebook and social media. Why do you think this story, we've been talking about nursing forever, why did this story touch off such a nerve, you think?
I don't know why this particular story touched off a nerve, but I do understand, and I'm quite sensitive to the people that are concerned that is this an exclusionary policy when, if you think about the actual existing practice of breastfeeding and the biological attachment that babies have, particularly like a 10-day-old baby, or 10-day-year-old, what?
10-day.
Yeah, a 10-day-old baby would have with his mother, and the feeding schedule may not be exactly on the hour as she was suggesting or whatnot. You can't predict when the actual baby will need to be fed and whatnot. And so, in some sense, though, if we say you have to exclude babies, then in this particular case, you will also be excluding mothers at the same time too. And for her to be able to develop business connections, to be able to network, this would be an exclusionary policy that could affect her work life too.
Well, we like to end the discussion on a happy note, which brings in the new McDonald's mascot called Happy, ostensibly to promote healthy food. Some people have called it a box with teeth. Michael, what's your reaction to the new mascot? For
It looks scary. Bring back Ronald. Ronald's an icon. Bring back Ronald. Why do we need a new one?
Cheryl, what was your initial reaction?
Well, the character is based on a box, but the box is so scary, no child in his or her right mind is going to open that container to check out the healthy fare inside. So they're going to run screaming back to the French fries. And I mean, talk about subliminal advertising and messaging. This is just pure evil genius.
Stephanie, evil genius? What do you think?
I don't know if it's evil genius, because I thought the way that it was designed, that they just open it up to a 7th grade classroom and whoever won it was going to be the one that they picked for the actual contest winner, to use for the mascot. I mean, I agree with the guy that was that we were listening to that says he's in marketing, and he just thought maybe they didn't spend as much time in product development as they could have.
Well, I'm never happy to wrap up the discussion, but we have to. Thanks to our guests, Michael Puente, Cheryl Jefferson, and Stephanie Farmer. We appreciate it.